All right, so I have seen Day of the Dead before. However, I just watched it again tonight, and I figured, okay, I've seen Night of the Living Dead several times. I personally really enjoy the remake from Tom Savini. I've seen Dawn of the Dead, the original, probably five times, the remake two or three times. However, Day of the Dead, never seen the remakes, because I've always been terrified of them because they're just so terribly, like, everybody says they're awful, and, like, Day of the Dead Bloodlines and all that shit. Like, there's a sequel to the remake, and they're like made from sci-fi. They're super low budget and just like stay away. But I'd actually seen Day of the Dead only one time, about 3 or 4 years ago, and I remember really liking it. And I was sitting with a friend of mine, and I was like, I'm either gonna rewatch The Thing, or I'm going to rewatch Day of the Dead. And so we decided, fuck it, let's watch Day of the Dead because it was on HBO Max. And it is the third installment in the Dead trilogy. You had Night, Dawn, and Day. Night of the Living Dead's a classic, obviously. Dawn of the Dead is personally one of my favorite. Probably, well, 28 Days Later is my favorite zombie movie, but it's one of my favorite horror films from the 70s for sure. Just taking place at a mall. I mean, come on, it's a zombie apocalypse mall. How can you possibly, you know, contend with that in a zombie apocalypse? But no, Day of the Dead. It's an interesting little setting and vibe as opposed to the other two because it is a considerable amount into the zombie apocalypse. Right, obviously, Night of the Living Dead is right when it starts. Dawn of the Dead is during the time when it's really starting to grow, and then Day of the Dead is far into the outbreak. It's been like I think it's been a month, right? And like it's 400,000 to one as far as zombies to human survival rates. So yeah, and it's very different than the first two. In that the cast of characters, despite it being pretty uh, later on into the apocalypse, there's a lot more characters than there are in the other films. Obviously, in Night of the Living Dead, there is a pretty there's a lot of tension amongst the characters who are trying to survive. Dawn of the Dead, not as much, because in Dawn of the Dead, there's a lot fewer characters, and it really builds upon the friendships and the relationships that the characters build in order to survive. And you really feel for those. And I think the characters in Dawn of the Dead is another thing that just makes that movie so good. But in Day of the Dead, there are so many characters that are just complete assholes, so many unlikable pieces of shit that you just want to die. And there are at the same time there are a lot of likable characters, and I feel like Day of the Dead is more of an analysis on the human beings and how they deal with each other in tense situations as opposed to how they deal with the zombies, because obviously it's taking place in this underground like military bunker, and they're all very well aware of what's going on outside. It's not some sort of new, trying to learn on the fly. Like they already have all of their survival tactics down pat, and they're just trying to find a way to, I guess, survive. I mean, it's pretty bleak. At one point in the movie, it talks about there being 400,000, as I said, zombies for every one person living. And so, with that in mind, the characters, you've got some good ones, some likable characters. I think all the characters are pretty good. There are a few guys that you kind of forget about as far as like the soldiers, because there's one woman, there's a couple minorities, and then there's the doctor. Those are all the good guys, right? You've got fuck, I forget her name. I want to say her name is Sarah. She's the lone female. She's pretty much the protagonist, I would say, and she does a good job. She kind of gives off Last Girl vibes. And Dawn of the Dead did come out in 1985, so perhaps that is, one of the things that is developed throughout the horror genre from Dawn of the Dead to Day of the Dead, because in Dawn of the Dead, the female character who's pretty much the lead, because there's like only 3 or 4 main actors in that movie, is rather weak and reminds me of the secondary female in Alien. She's kind of a drag, however she does kind of step up at the end. But throughout this movie, I think her name is Sarah. Like 90% sure her name's Sarah. She does a pretty good job, and she's a pretty badass chick who doesn't really put up with a lot of bullshit. And then you've got I don't remember his name, unfortunately, and this is sad because I've watched this movie 2 times, but it has been years since I watched it the original first time. But we have the Latino guy with the big beard who gets his arm chopped off, and then you have the Jamaican dude. Those guys are cool. I like them. And then I think my two favorite characters are the polar opposite. You have Lieutenant Rhodes, or Sergeant Rhodes, Captain Rhodes. I don't remember. He is one of the most unlikable characters I think I've ever seen. He is such a hateable villain. He does a fantastic job, just straight up. Like, he's great in the movie. And he is just the biggest piece of shit. He's awful. Every time you're on screen, you just want to put a fucking bullet through his head, because he is just such a narcissistic, no good motherfucker who is just foiling all plans of survival and just making things so much more stressful and just inefficient than they were originally, right? He just muddies everything up. And then at the other end of the spectrum, my other favorite character is Dr. Frankenstein, right? I think his name is Logan, I believe. He's awesome, right? He's just this big, lovable scientist who's trying his best, and he's kind of gone crazy a little bit with all the madness going on. And they have him trying to work with the zombies and try and, I guess just make them intelligent, or just kind of test how smart they can or can't be. And obviously you have the iconic part of this movie that everybody remembers when they watch it is Bub, the zombie, who is, able to shoot a gun, who shows emotion, who, listens to music and excuse me, does all of this stuff. And it's like, this movie is really special. It's nothing like a conventional zombie movie, and it's very different than both Dawn and Night. However, in some ways, I can understand why some might actually prefer this movie over those two. Personally, I think Dawn of the Dead is hands down my favorite, but nonetheless, I think Day of the Dead focuses a lot more on, as I said, the characters in the confined space, and how that they have all of these conflicting viewpoints. And you have Dr. Frankenstein, who's kind of crazy, and he's trying to run all these tests on the dead bodies of the people who die, and like he killed the captain just to study his brain. And like you've got Captain Rhodes, who's just a fucking madman who is just on this insane power trip. And then you've got like his goons that are just kind of working below him, who are just pretty much following his orders and are just complete assholes. The guy looks like fucking El Presador. There are a few kind of throwaway characters who are just like military dudes that have guns that don't really add much to the plot. But personally, when it comes to the actual violence that is involved in the zombie films, I think it does a pretty good job as well. Specifically the scenes when they're like in the dark, whenever they're escaping. Those are really tense. Obviously the classic shovel, where he spites the spade head inside the zombie's mouth and then shovels it back. And I love the little bit where like after his head has been decapitated and they run off, that shows the shot of them in the background running, and then like the eyes are just like glancing around. Always kind of something that stuck out, and that was one of the ones that was very memorable to me. And then obviously there were two Gore scenes that I was like, I'm waiting for these to happen because they were so awesome the first time I watched it. The other being when the I don't remember who he is. He's one of the throwaway soldiers, is getting killed, and all the zombies are converging on him, and they rip out his fucking throat while he's screaming, and it like becomes super like high pitched because he's they rip out his vocal cords while he's screaming, and so it kind of makes sense why his voice would stress like that. And I've got a lot of really good things to say about this movie. I think it's really underrated. I feel like it's a little more complex than the other two, in that it's not all action, because I think Dawn of the Dead is like, it's a fucking shopping mall, and I can understand why anybody would like that, because it's just like the ultimate, you know, perspective. Like, oh, I wonder what I would do. It's the perfect setting. Like, oh, it has everything we need. And then like Night of the Living Dead obviously is just such a iconic, groundbreaking movie for the zombie genre. And so that leads me to think that Day of the Dead is probably overlooked, which I don't think it should be. I really don't. I feel like it's a really, really good movie. I think it's great. Absolutely worth a rewatch, clearly, because I watched it for a second time. I'd watch it for a third or even a fourth time. Straight up. I would say one of my favorite parts is when Captain Rhodes takes off on those motherfuckers like a peon and goes away to Venus. Had to say that because it takes place in Florida. But he's like taking off on the little scooter, and like his little goons are like, Rhodes, you son of a bitch. And like, dude, he takes off on a golf cart going like 8 miles per hour. And like they were right behind him, and just as soon as he took off, they just like didn't even try to chase him. And they were like, oh, he's gotten away. That shit, me and my fucking roommate just cracked up watching that. We had to go back and watch it because he just looks so ridiculous riding on this go-kart going like 6 miles per hour in front of all these zombies. But no, the ending is great. I love it. It's just, it is a very, very satisfying movie to watch. And I'm thinking about anything I can ding this movie on. I can potentially see how some might not enjoy the lack of violence. However, I do think there is plenty of violence. I think there's plenty of blood and guts for sure. Tom Savini did a fantastic job. And honestly, man, I mean, I would recommend this movie to pretty much anybody and everybody across the board. I would recommend it to a casual, although I could understand why they may become rather disinterested. Or if you were to show them Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead, I could understand why potentially this wouldn't be the most entertaining. However, I would absolutely, recommend it to a film fan. It's a horror classic. It's probably the best. It's the best zombie movie I've seen from the 80s, straight up. And so, yeah, honestly, I'm feeling like there's really nothing that bothered me too much with this. I'm giving it a 5 out of 5. And if you were really nitpicking and maybe adding on like a 10 scale, maybe like a 9 out of 10, but I'm giving it a 5 out of 5 because from personal preference, the lack of, constant battling and, the approach of having more conflict between characters not involving the zombies, I don't mind that, as opposed to just having it's just free for all survival versus nothing but zombies. Like, that's Dawn of the Dead, and Dawn of the Dead does that really well. In Day of the Dead, it's a nice trade-off, and it's equally as effective. Personally, I think I'd slightly prefer Dawn of the Dead just because you're in a mall, but I think Day of the Dead itself is amazing, and I think it's an 80s horror classic, one of the best zombie films ever made. George A. Romero is the GOAT. 5 out of 5, definitely recommend.